It's a sobering thought that even with all the advancements in modern medicine, somewhere between 3 and, well, 17% of people undergoing surgery in developed countries will still face a major complication.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant risk hanging in the air, isn't it?
It really is. But what if there was a surprisingly straightforward solution, something that could dramatically lower that number?
Hmm.
Today, we're diving into the world of surgical safety checklists.
And, for listeners trying to stay informed, maybe it's about something directly impacting your life, or perhaps you're just curious. It can often feel like just being bombarded with information,
Yeah,
right?
totally. Information overload.
Exactly. So our aim with this deep dive is really to cut through that noise. We want to focus specifically on what you need to know about these surgical safety checklists.
And we're drawing from a whole collection of research here. Systematic reviews, practical guides, studies looking at how they work in the real world.
Right. Solid stuff.
So, today, our mission is basically to understand the nuts and bolts of these checklists. What are they? Why are they such a hot topic in patient safety? What does the data actually tell us about their impact? And maybe most importantly, what are the crucial elements that determine if they really make a difference or not?
Okay, so let's get right to it then.
Yeah.
What exactly are we talking about when we say surgical safety checklist?
Good question.
Well, at its heart, it's a simple tool. Really simple. It's designed to make surgery safer for patients
How?
by making sure critical steps get done consistently and that everyone on the surgical team is talking to each other. Clear communication.
Like a safety net woven into the process.
That's a good way to put it, a safety net. And the big one, the one you hear about most, is probably the World Health Organization, the WHO checklist.
Right, the WHO, and it's meant to be adaptable, isn't it, for different kinds of surgery?
That's right. Very adaptable. And it's structured around 3 key moments, 3 phases in the surgical journey.
Okay. What's the first one?
The first is right before anesthesia is given.
So,
here, the team confirms essential stuff, like, the patient's identity.
crucial.
Absolutely. Checks that all the anesthesia gear is working properly and make sure that a pulse oximeter, that little finger clip thing monitoring oxygen, is on and working.
Got it. Phase 1, before anesthesia. What's next?
Then we move to the moment just before the surgeon actually makes the first cut, the incision.
Okay.
This is often called the timeout. The whole team pauses, introduces themselves if they haven't already.
Important for teamwork.
Definitely. They review the critical steps of the operation that's planned, and they confirm antibiotics have been given if needed, to prevent infection.
Okay, makes sense. And the third phase?
The final phase happens before the patient actually leaves the operating room, the sign-out.
All right.
In this step, the team confirms things like counting instruments and sponges, making sure nothing's left behind.
Yeah, you hear horror stories about that.
Exactly. They also double-check that any tissue samples, specimens, are labeled correctly, and they discuss any concerns for the patient's immediate recovery. Everyone's clear on the next steps.
Okay, so those are the 3 core phases of the WHO checklist. But you mentioned it's not the only one.
No, not at all. Our sources mentioned others, too. There's one called SURPASS, which is actually broader. It looks at safety from hospital admission right through to discharge.
Wow, the whole journey.
Yeah. And then there are also very specific checklists, laser-focused on preventing things like wrong site surgery, operating on the wrong limb or wrong side of the body.
Which, incredibly, still happens sometimes.
It does. Unbelievably.
So why this huge focus on something that seems, on the surface, pretty basic, just a checklist?
Well, like we said at the start, surgical complications, these adverse events, they're a massive global health problem. They cause a lot of illness and, sadly, death.
And the root cause often comes back to communication.
Again and again. It's actually quite startling. The Joint Commission, they looked at adverse events reported over a decade, from 1995 to 2005. They found communication breakdowns were a factor in nearly 70% of them. 70.
Wow, that is huge.
It really is. And what's interesting is the people in the OR, the nurses and doctors, they see it too.
They recognize the problem.
Oh, yeah. In one survey, about 2/3 of both nurses and physicians said better team communication was the most important thing for improving safety and efficiency in surgery.
So they know it's an issue.
Definitely. And it's not just a feeling. Research has actually tried to measure this. Studies show communication errors happen in roughly 30% of team exchanges during an operation.
30%.
And here's the kicker. About a third of those errors actually put the patient's safety at risk.
Gosh, so that's where the checklist comes in. It's designed to tackle that problem head on.
Precisely. It's a structured way to bridge those communication gaps. The WHO guidelines themselves really stress this. For safe surgery, the team has to communicate effectively, share critical info.
So the checklist creates specific moments for that.
Exactly. It fosters teamwork in what can be a really high-stress place. And what's fascinating is, many surgeons might think, oh, we already do this stuff.
Right. It's just common sense.
Yeah, but the data actually shows a gap. A gap between thinking it's done and it consistently being done. The checklist forces that consistency.
Okay, so we get the problem complications, and we see the proposed fix these checklists. But the million-dollar question, right? Do they actually work? What's the evidence say?
That is the key question. We looked closely at a big systematic review. Its title was basically Surgical Checklists, a systematic review of impacts and implementation.
Okay, and what did it find?
The findings were pretty compelling, actually. The review concluded that using these checklists is linked to several positive outcomes.
Like what specifically? Can you give examples?
Sure. The review found that when checklists were used, the surgical teams got much better at spotting potential safety hazards before they caused harm.
Okay, proactive detection. That's good.
Very good. They also saw a clear trend towards fewer overall surgical complications, fewer things going wrong.
Nice.
And, maybe not surprisingly, given our chat about communication, they also noted improvements in how well the OR staff talk to each other. Better teamwork.
That makes sense. We also looked at another review, didn't we, on cognitive aids in emergencies.
We did. Now, that one was broader, looking at various tools, not just surgical checklists. It covered 13 randomized controlled trials on different cognitive aids.
And some of those trials focused specifically on surgical checklists.
Yes, some did. And importantly, the reviewers assessed the risk of bias in those trials, which helps us judge the strength of the findings.
Right, quality control for the research itself.
Exactly. And beyond those big reviews, we also look at individual studies, ones that tracked what happened when specific hospitals actually put the WHO checklist into practice.
Real-world data.
Right. For example, one study by Askarian and colleagues back in 2011 found a really dramatic drop in surgical complications after they brought in the checklist.
Oh, dramatic.
It went from almost 23% down to 10%.
Wow. More than halved. That's the kind of result that really gets your attention.
It certainly does. And then a completely different setting. Yon and colleagues in 2012 studied 2 hospitals in Liberia.
Okay.
They found a strong link between using the WHO checklist and lower rates of both surgical site infections and overall complications. The stats, the odds ratios, suggested a pretty substantial protective effect.
Interesting. So it seems to work across different healthcare systems, too.
It hints at that, yes. And it also suggests that, the financial benefit isn't just avoiding those huge lawsuits for major errors. It's also about the cumulative savings from preventing lots of smaller but still costly issues.
Good point. Any other examples?
Yeah, another one. Van Cly and his team, also 2012, they found that when the WHO checklist came in, the odds of patients dying within 30 days after surgery actually went down.
Okay, that's a direct impact on mortality. You can't argue with that.
Pretty significant, yes. Now, we need a balanced view here.
Of course.
Some studies, like one by Vatz and colleagues in 2010, didn't find a big change in overall illness or death rates after implementation.
Ah, okay, so mixed results.
Well, context is key. In their study, the starting rates of those complications were already very, very low.
Ah, so less room for improvement on those big metrics.
Exactly. But even then, they did see improvements in specific safety processes, like making sure antibiotics were given on time more reliably.
So even if the headline numbers don't shift much because they're already good, the checklist still helps lock in those important safety steps.
That seems to be the case. It reinforces good habits.
Okay. So the evidence generally looks pretty positive. Checklists can be beneficial, but I guess just, slapping a checklist poster on the OR wall isn't enough.
Absolutely not. That won't magically fix things.
So what does it take? What are the keys to making them actually work effectively?
You're right. Implementation is crucial. And the systematic review we talked about, plus another study looking specifically at nurses' perspectives, really highlighted several key factors.
Like what?
Well, one really big one is getting buy-in from the top. Yeah. Having hospital leaders act as local champions for the checklist. That makes a huge difference in getting everyone else on board.
Leadership matters. Makes sense. What else?
Involving the actual staff who'll be using it every day, getting their feedback, adapting the checklist so it fits their workflow, their specific hospital. That's vital.
Tailoring it.
Yes. And avoiding redundancy, making sure it doesn't just repeat steps that are already solidly covered by other processes. You don't want to create busy work.
Practical stuff.
Very practical. Also, proper education and training on how to use it correctly. And this came up frequently,
Yeah.
getting surgeons fully engaged.
Surgeon buy-in. Why is that highlighted so often?
Well, the nurses' study found it was a statistically significant factor for success. Surgeons are often team leaders in the OR, so their attitude can really set the tone.
Right. If the surgeon doesn't take it seriously.
It makes it much harder for everyone else to. Interestingly, you'd think surgeons, being so focused on outcomes, would be the first to embrace anything promising better safety, but,
Yeah.
well, we'll get to barriers later.
What else helps?
The nurses' study also mentioned having leadership actually visible, present in the surgical center, to encourage use, kind of showing they care.
Boots on the ground.
Sort of, yeah. And taking a gradual approach often helps. Pilot testing at first, maybe in one OR, working out the kinks, then rolling it out more widely.
Instead of a big bang approach.
Right. Though, interestingly, the nurses' study didn't find pilot testing or gradual introduction to be statistically significant factors, but they are often recommended.
What else?
Strong institutional support is key, like actually building the checklist into existing paperwork or electronic systems, making it part of the normal routine.
Integrating it.
Exactly. And finally, closing the loop.
Yeah.
Auditing how it's being used, giving feedback to the teams on their performance, and sharing the results, showing that it is making a difference.
Okay, so that's the recipe for success. Leadership, staff involvement, training, integration, feedback.
Pretty much covers the key facilitators, yeah.
But it can't always be smooth sailing. What are the common roadblocks? What makes implementation hard?
Oh, there are definitely challenges. Several common hurdles pop up. One of the biggest is just resistance.
From who?
From some members of the OR team. And yes, surgeons are often mentioned here.
Why the resistance?
It often comes from a belief that we already do this stuff, a feeling that the checklist items are just common practice anyway.
Even if the data shows inconsistency.
Even then.
Yeah.
There's also the perception, sometimes reality, if not done well, that it causes unnecessary delays, slows things down.
Time pressure in the OR is real.
It absolutely is. And then there's a surprising one. Some staff worry about legal implications. Signing the checklist, could that make them liable if something goes wrong later?
Hadn't thought of that angle.
It comes up. Another issue is checklist fatigue. If a hospital has tons of checklists for everything, people can just start tuning them out.
Like notification overload on your phone.
Exactly. You just ignore them after a while. And a lack of real, visible support from hospital admin and leadership, that can kill implementation efforts.
The flip side of leadership being a facilitator.
Precisely. The nurses' study found lack of leadership support was a statistically significant barrier. Same for not having a dedicated patient safety nucleus or group within the hospital.
What else?
Trying to introduce it too abruptly without planning or preparation, that was another statistically significant barrier in the nurses' study. And simply not monitoring its use. If no one's checking, compliance can easily slip.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Pretty much. Then there's simple disbelief in the benefits, skepticism. And the inherent hierarchy in surgical teams can sometimes make it hard for, say, a nurse to speak up if a senior surgeon skips a step.
Power dynamics.
Yes, and very practical things, too. One study in Thailand mentioned things like simply not having the right skin markers available for marking the surgical site.
Basic supplies.
Yeah. Or even cultural factors. That same Thai study noted a reluctance, culturally, for team members to introduce themselves publicly, which made the timeout phase a bit awkward initially.
Wow, culture plays a role, too.
It can. And maybe one of the most sobering findings is from studies showing that even when hospitals report high checklist compliance, say 90%, the quality of that compliance, the fidelity, how thoroughly and meaningfully it's actually being done can be much lower. People just ticking boxes without engaging.
Going through the motion.
Exactly. And sometimes there's just basic confusion. Who's supposed to lead this check? When exactly do we do step 3?
So lots of potential pitfalls.
Definitely. It really drives home that just having the checklist document isn't the answer. You have to tackle these human and organizational factors head on.
Let's switch gears slightly. What about the cost? Is investing in checklists worth it financially?
That's a really practical question. There was a hypothetical analysis, a decision analysis, done by Samel and colleagues back in 2010.
Okay, what did they model?
They basically estimated the costs of putting a checklist program in place. Training, materials, maybe a bit of extra time. And they compared that to the estimated costs of treating major surgical complications, which can be incredibly expensive.
Right, long hospital stays, more treatments.
Exactly. And their analysis suggested that, yeah, checklists could actually be cost-saving in the long run. By preventing those costly complications, the initial investment pays off.
It's a powerful argument for hospital administrators. Safety pays.
It can be, yes. It shows that good safety measures aren't just about ethics. They can make financial sense, too.
But are there any caveats, limitations we should keep in mind?
Yeah, a couple of important points. One is that checklists on their own are sometimes called a weak security barrier.
Weak? What does that mean?
It means they rely heavily on human behavior. They're easy to ignore, skip, or do poorly if the culture and reinforcement aren't there. They're not like a physical lock or an automated system.
So they require constant vigilance and buy-in.
Absolutely. Successful implementation isn't just rolling out a form. It's about changing behaviors, building new habits, embedding it in the culture. That takes effort and time.
And we mentioned tailoring earlier. The WHO checklist is great, but maybe not perfect for everyone.
That's right. While it's a fantastic, widely used template, the sources often recommend adapting checklists to the local context, the specific hospital, the specific types of surgery, the existing workflows. One size doesn't always fit all perfectly.
Makes sense. Any other considerations?
Just a brief mention of the global perspective. Implementing these checklists effectively in countries with fewer resources, say medium or low Human Development Index countries, faces extra hurdles.
Like what?
Lack of basic infrastructure, maybe unreliable equipment, shortages of trained staff. These are significant barriers that need specific, context-aware strategies to overcome. It's not always as simple as just translating the checklist.
Right. Context is everything. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the main takeaway, the key message for listeners?
I think the core message is that these surgical safety checklists, even though they seem simple, maybe just a piece of paper, they are actually a really powerful tool.
How so?
They make surgery safer. They do it by creating these dedicated moments for the team to communicate and by ensuring those critical safety steps are followed every single time.
And the evidence backs this up.
Yeah, the evidence is pretty strong. It suggests they're linked to fewer complications and maybe even lower mortality rates.
Yeah.
That's significant.
And beyond just checklists work, what's the deeper insight here?
I think the real nugget is that the checklist itself isn't magic. Its success is tangled up with the whole safety culture of the place. It depends on everyone on the team being engaged, from the surgeon to the nurse to the anesthesiologist. And it absolutely needs that support from leadership we talked about.
So the challenges in implementing them actually tell us a lot.
They really do. They highlight all the human factors, the organizational stuff. That comes into play when you try to introduce even the best-intentioned safety tool. It's not just about the tool. It's about the people using it.
Which leads to a really interesting thought to leave people with.
Yeah.
Well, thinking beyond surgery, what lessons can other fields learn from this? Anywhere you have complex tasks, multiple people working together under pressure?
Right, like aviation maybe, or other high-stakes industries.
Exactly. What can they learn from the successes, but also the struggles of getting surgical checklists adopted? How do you prevent errors and improve outcomes in those settings?
And maybe how do you foster that checklist mindset that focuses on critical steps without it just becoming a robotic tick box exercise, keeping it meaningful?
That's a really great question to ponder. We definitely encourage listeners to maybe dig into the sources we mentioned or look for examples of checklists in other fields.
Yeah, consider how those principles, clear communication standard procedures, might apply in your own work or areas of interest.
Absolutely. Well, this has been fascinating. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.